The Nexari Collective prided itself on having solved the universe, not in the flashy, dramatic way that lesser civilizations might attempt, with super weapons or reality-bending technologies, but through the far more sophisticated approach of mathematics. They had reduced galactic civilization to a series of elegant equations, each species neatly categorized by development vectors, predictable growth patterns, and reassuringly stable behavioral matrices. Their capital world of Axiom Prime hummed with the quiet satisfaction of beings who had figured out the cosmic joke and found it disappointingly logical. Crystalline spires stretched toward perfectly calculated orbital positions, their surfaces displaying real-time data streams that tracked every significant civilization across 17 sectors. The Nexari had turned empire building into applied mathematics, and the universe had been cooperative enough to follow their formulas, until humanity showed up and started dividing by zero. The Committee of Universal Oversight convened in their traditional formation, a geometric arrangement that optimized both acoustic properties and psychological comfort zones, to address what their senior analysts had classified as a statistical impossibility requiring corrective intervention. The phrase sounded much more professional than "those weird mammals are breaking our spreadsheets," though it meant essentially the same thing. Primary calculator Zextool adjusted her sensory apparatus to review the latest data compilation, each gesture precise enough to satisfy a metronome. "Fellow calculators," she began, her translated voice carrying the sort of measured authority that comes from never having encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient data analysis. "We face an unprecedented deviation in galactic development patterns." The assembled Nexari rustled with the mathematical equivalent of concern, a subtle frequency shift in their collective humming that indicated computational distress. In their perfectly ordered society, unprecedented was the sort of word that appeared in disaster protocols and emergency procedures. The species designated humans continues to violate fundamental laws of civilizational progression, continued Zextool, manipulating holographic displays that showed development curves spiraling into impossible territories. Their technological advancement rate exceeds predictive models by factors that approach mathematical impossibility. They achieve diplomatic solutions with species we calculate as inherently hostile. Most disturbing, they demonstrate consistent success through methods our algorithms classify as random chance, elevated to strategic doctrine. Calculator Vortham, whose specialty involved long-term civilizational modeling, emitted a frequency that translated roughly as frustrated bewilderment. Their expansion patterns follow no recognizable logic. They establish colonies in systems our models identify as unsuitable, then somehow make them not only viable but thriving. They negotiate treaties with civilizations that should, by all mathematical certainty, consider them natural enemies. Worse, added calculator Yexayandra, whose area of expertise covered military probability matrices, their combat effectiveness scales exponentially under adverse conditions. The more impossible their situation, the more likely they are to achieve victory through methods that shouldn't work, but somehow do. The committee fell into the sort of contemplative silence that mathematically inclined beings experience when the universe stops making sense. For a civilization that had spent millennia reducing reality to predictable formulas, humanity represented something far more threatening than mere military opposition. They represented chaos theory made manifest. Primary calculator Zextool manipulated the central display to show a three-dimensional representation of galactic stability indices. The human variable has introduced unacceptable uncertainty into our projections. Their influence spreads through diplomatic and economic channels we cannot predict or model. They must be isolated before their chaotic influence compromises the entire galactic equation. The solution, when it emerged from their collective analysis, was elegant in its mathematical simplicity. Remove the variable. Place humanity in a controlled environment where their disruptive influence could be contained, while the rest of the galaxy continued its orderly development according to established patterns. Kronos-Delta offers optimal containment parameters, reported calculator Vortham, displaying planetary analysis data with the satisfaction of someone presenting a particularly neat proof. Class 7 hostile environment, minimal resource availability, extreme isolation from major space lanes. The mathematical probability of establishing sustainable civilization approaches 0.03%. Perfect, agreed Zextool, though she would later have cause to reconsider her definition of perfection. Initiate isolation protocol Omega, all human populations to be relocated to Kronos-Delta, effective immediately. The transport operations proceeded with typical Nexari efficiency, which is to say, they were mathematically optimized for cargo throughput rather than passenger comfort. Massive containment vessels, originally designed for relocating livestock across agricultural worlds, had been hastily converted for human transport. The Nexari saw no meaningful distinction between the two applications, which should have been another warning sign about their understanding of their cargo. Kronos-Delta hung in space like a cosmic middle finger extended toward anyone foolish enough to consider it habitable. The planet's surface temperatures varied between extremely unpleasant and technically lethal, with weather patterns that could charitably be described as aggressively hostile. Its atmosphere required filtration systems just to avoid immediate toxicity, and its geological composition seemed designed specifically to frustrate any attempt at resource extraction. In short, it was exactly the sort of place that would make most civilized species reconsider their life choices. The Nexari had calculated it as the perfect prison for a species they considered annoyingly unpredictable. They had somehow failed to consider what humans might do when given unlimited access to adversity. Colonel Janet Moreau stepped off the transport vessel onto the rocky surface of Kronos-Delta and did what humans do when faced with impossible situations. She started laughing, not the bitter laughter of defeat, but the genuinely delighted chuckle of someone who had just been handed exactly the sort of challenge that made life interesting. "Well, team," she announced to the assembled group of humanity's finest undesirables, a collection that included some of the most brilliant engineers, strategists, and troublemakers the species had produced. "Looks like we've been given a fixer-upper." Tech specialist Dmitry Hassan was already analyzing atmospheric readings with equipment he had modified during the journey. His modifications had turned basic environmental scanners into devices that could map molecular compositions in real time and identify potential resource deposits from orbit. Improvements that would have impressed the Nexari if they had bothered to understand what they were looking at. "Breathable, with basic filtration," he reported, though his tone suggested he was already calculating improvements. "High mineral density and the atmospheric suspension. We're basically breathing a pharmaceutical laboratory. And these geological formations," he gestured at the twisted spires of crystalline rock surrounding their landing site, "natural defensive positions and potential power sources." Geologist Luna Park was examining samples of the local bedrock with the sort of focused intensity that made her colleagues nervous. Her background in exotic mineralogy had made her persona non grata in several star systems, where she had discovered resources that local governments preferred to keep secret. "This isn't a prison planet," she announced with barely contained excitement. "This is a treasure vault with a security system. These formations contain rare Earth elements that could power starships, building materials stronger than anything in common use, and mineral combinations that could revolutionize manufacturing." Observer Thexani watched the initial human survey from his monitoring station in high orbit, dutifully recording data that would later be filed under expected adaptation difficulties. His sensors detected the standard signs of species displacement, elevated stress indicators, disorganized movement patterns, and what his analysis protocols classified as survival focal behavioral clustering. His reports to the Nexari High Command maintained the optimistic tone expected of someone overseeing a successful containment operation. Human subjects displaying predicted disorientation responses, population dispersal following anticipated survival patterns, estimate complete social breakdown within 4 calculation cycles. What he failed to notice, because his species had never developed the conceptual framework for it, was that the humans weren't just surviving, they were planning. Every shelter was positioned according to defensive sightlines, every supply cache was strategically placed for rapid redistribution. Every work crew had been carefully selected for skills that had nothing to do with basic survival and everything to do with building something significantly more ambitious. Month 2 brought developments that made Thexani's sensors register readings he didn't quite know how to interpret. The human settlement was expanding, according to patterns that suggested either exceptional organizational efficiency or access to construction technologies that shouldn't exist. Power generation was exceeding all projections for primitive survival equipment. Most puzzling, the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. Colonel Moreau stood atop what Thexani's scans identified as a communications tower, which was technically accurate, though it failed to capture the fact that the structure housed the most sophisticated information network humanity had ever constructed. Built from components salvaged from their transport ships and powered by Kronos-Delta's unique crystal formations, it could coordinate activities across the entire planet and maintain contact with ships in neighboring star systems. Status report, she requested through her comm unit, which connected her to a network that would have given military planners across known space serious cases of professional envy. Infrastructure development proceeding ahead of schedule, reported Dmitry Hassan from what the orbital sensors classified as a workshop facility, but was actually a manufacturing complex, capable of producing advanced technology from local materials. The mineral deposits are even better than Lunar's initial estimates. We're not just building tools, we're revolutionizing them. Defensive positions are at 75% completion, added Major Carlos Webb, whose official designation was Agricultural Coordinator, but whose actual speciality involved making strategic installations look like peaceful settlements. The cave systems provide perfect cover for our real construction projects. Luna Park's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose wildest theories had been proven correct. The geological surveys are revealing possibilities I never imagined. These formations don't just contain rare materials, they amplify energy transmission. We're building a power grid that could support a small fleet. Month 4 brought the arrival of humanity's second wave of undesirable elements, which included theoretical physicists, weapons specialists, and engineers whose expertise covered fields that didn't officially exist in most civilizations. The Nexari had helpfully continued their relocation program, systematically removing every human they considered potentially disruptive to galactic order. Professor Yuki Tanaka stepped off the transport ship and immediately began calculating structural possibilities for defensive positions that hadn't been built yet. Her background in theoretical warfare had made her unwelcome in polite galactic society, but here on Kronos-Delta, her knowledge was not just appreciated, it was essential. Impressive work, she told Colonel Moreau during her first briefing, reviewing holographic displays that showed the colony's true scope. Beneath the surface installations that aliens could detect lay a network of facilities that would have given pause to civilizations with millennia of military experience. We've had excellent raw materials to work with, Moreau replied, with the sort of understatement that humans excelled at. Turns out our prison came with everything we needed to build something special. Month 8 marked the completion of what could only be described as humanity's most ambitious construction project. Kronos-Delta now housed defensive systems capable of tracking objects across multiple star systems, manufacturing facilities that could produce technologies beyond most civilizations' design capabilities, and power generation systems that tap directly into the planet's unique geological properties. The underground tunnel networks connected every major installation, allowing for rapid movement and supply distribution even under orbital bombardment. The surface structures, which continued to register as simple survival settlements on alien scans, were actually sophisticated defensive positions capable of coordinating planetary defense against invasion fleets. More importantly, the humans had done what humans do best when left to their own devices. They had made friends. Communication networks had established contact with independent civilizations across the sector, species that the Nexari had dismissed as mathematically irrelevant. These new allies provided resources, information, and alternative perspectives on galactic politics that painted the Collective's decisions in increasingly unfavorable light. Thexani's reports had grown increasingly confused, as his sensors detected energy signatures that violated several supposedly universal physical laws. His requests for guidance from high command had been met with mathematical analysis that insisted his readings must be incorrect. After all, how could a contained population be generating power outputs equivalent to industrial worlds? The answer to that question arrived in the form of Prime Assessor Keel Votan, whose reputation for thorough investigation was matched only by his complete inability to comprehend problems that couldn't be solved through proper data analysis. His assessment fleet dropped out of hyperspace, expecting to find a struggling refugee settlement, and instead encountered sensor readings that made their navigation computers recalculate their position 3 times. Observer Thexani, the Prime Assessor's communication carried the sort of controlled panic that comes from discovering your carefully calculated reality has become wildly unpredictable. Explain these energy signatures. I assure you, Prime Assessor, my observations have been completely accurate, Thexani replied, though his confidence had been steadily eroding for months. The humans remain contained on the planetary surface. Then perhaps you can explain why my sensors detect defensive arrays capable of engaging capital ships, manufacturing facilities that exceed Class 5 industrial standards, and power generation systems that appear to violate several fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The assessment fleet's approach to Kronos-Delta proceeded with all the confidence of beings who had never encountered humanity's particular approach to problem-solving. As they descended through the planet's atmosphere, their sensors began registering details that made Keel Vothan's mathematical certainty develop uncomfortable cracks. The surface installations that should have been desperate survival structures revealed themselves as sophisticated defensive positions. The mining operations that were supposed to be resource gathering showed industrial capacity that rivaled manufacturing worlds. Most disturbing, the humans didn't seem particularly concerned about the arrival of an alien assessment fleet. Colonel Moreau met the Nexari delegation in what Keel Votan assumed was the settlement's administrative center. In reality, it was a command complex buried 4 levels underground, surrounded by defensive systems that could withstand direct assault from orbital platforms, and connected to coordination centers that managed planetary defenses across 23 different strategic scenarios. "Welcome to Kronos-Delta," she said with the sort of professional courtesy that made Keel Volti calculations start generating error messages. "We call it home now. These facilities were not in our planetary assessments," the Prime Assessor observed, his analytical processes struggling with the gap between expectation and reality. "A lot of things weren't in your assessments," replied Moreau, gesturing to displays that showed the settlement's true scope. "Turns out you missed some pretty significant variables in your calculations." The briefing that followed was less a presentation and more an education in the fundamental differences between mathematical prediction and human adaptation. Where the Nexari had calculated obstacles, humans had found opportunities. Where the Nexari had projected failure, humans had engineered success. Where the Nexari had planned containment, humans had built expansion. "East defensive installations," Keel Vothan said, pointing at tactical displays that showed weapon systems capable of engaging multiple capital ships simultaneously. "Exceed the technological parameters we calculated for your species." "Funny thing about parameters," said Moreau with the sort of smile that made mathematical certainty feel suddenly fragile. "They're really more like suggestions when you're motivated enough." The tour that followed was carefully designed to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly the Nexari had misunderstood their own solution. Surface installations that looked like basic settlements from orbit revealed themselves as sophisticated defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. Manufacturing facilities that should have been desperate workshops showed production capabilities that could support extended military campaigns. The atmospheric processes that were supposed to barely maintain breathable air had transformed the planet's entire environmental system into something that exceeded garden worlds for habitability. Keel Vothan found himself standing in what the humans called Engineering Complex Delta, a designation that implied at least 3 other facilities of similar scope, watching production processes that rendered several supposedly universal technological limitations completely irrelevant. "How?" was all he managed to articulate. How what? Asked Professor Tanaka, who was simultaneously monitoring 15 different research projects while discussing optimal defensive strategies with engineering teams. How did you achieve this level of technological advancement? Our calculations indicated your species possessed insufficient knowledge base for these applications. Tanaka laughed, not the bitter sound of someone explaining their suffering, but the genuinely amused response of someone who had just heard a particularly good joke. You gave us everything we needed: unlimited resources, complete freedom from bureaucratic oversight, motivated personnel, and a challenge worthy of our problem-solving abilities. What did you calculate would happen? The Prime Assessor's return to his assessment fleet was marked by the sort of contemplative silence that comes from realizing one's entire world-view has become mathematically impossible. His communications with Nexari High Command grew increasingly urgent as the implications of their solution became clear. They have militarized the entire planet, he reported, his voice carrying frequencies that translated as existential mathematical crisis. This is not a containment facility, it is a fortress that could resist siege operations from multiple fleets. The response from High Command maintained a confident tone of beings who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient computational analysis. Prime Assessor, you are clearly miscalculating the capabilities of a contained population. Maintain observation protocols and submit corrected data. That corrected data, when it finally penetrated the layers of mathematical certainty surrounding Nexari leadership, caused the sort of systematic analytical failure that ripples through technocratic societies like cascading equation errors. Emergency calculation sessions were initiated, military probability matrices were recalibrated, intelligence-gathering operations were deployed to analyze a species they had assumed was mathematically contained. The intelligence analysis painted a picture that made career mathematicians consider alternative professions. Humanity hadn't just adapted to their exile, they had used it as an opportunity to build something that fundamentally altered the balance of power in their region of the galaxy. Their prison had become a staging ground for influence that extended far beyond their solar system. Trade relationships with peripheral civilizations had expanded into mutual defense agreements. Technology sharing had created networks of allied species that suddenly viewed the Nexari Collective with suspicion rather than mathematical respect. Most troubling, other civilizations were beginning to question the calculations that had justified humanity's exile in the first place. Colonel Moreau stood in the command center that occupied the heart of what had once been a mathematical solution and was now something that could only be described as a strategic stronghold. Holographic displays showed defensive positions that could coordinate resistance against invasion fleets, manufacturing capabilities that could support extended campaigns, and alliance networks that stretched across dozens of star systems. Final status report, she requested, though the question was now more ceremonial than necessary. The orbital sensors showed Kieldo-Thar's assessment fleet maintaining what could only be described as a respectful distance. All defensive systems operational and exceeding design specifications, reported Major Webb, whose agricultural coordination had evolved into managing the most sophisticated planetary defense grid in known space. We could maintain full defensive posture indefinitely with current resource production. Manufacturing output has stabilized at 120% of projections, added Dmitry Hassan, who had discovered that human engineering principles work remarkably well when applied to materials the universe had supposedly made impossible to work with. We're not just meeting our needs, we're building surplus capacity for export. Luna Park's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical knowledge had exceeded every practical application. Geological surveys have identified mineral deposits sufficient to supply a moderate-sized galactic civilization. We're sitting on resources that could reshape interstellar economics. The irony was mathematically perfect. The Nexari had attempted to solve the human equation by removing it from their calculations, and instead had given humanity exactly what it needed to become a factor that could no longer be ignored. The prison had become a fortress, the exiles had become defenders, and the solution had become the problem. Months turned into cycles, and the galaxy slowly recalculated itself around a new constant. The humans of Kronos-Delta weren't disappearing from the galactic equation, and their influence was expanding in ways that made traditional power structures increasingly unstable. Trade routes shifted to accommodate new alliances, military strategists revised their assessments of regional balance, diplomatic channels hummed with conversations that carefully avoided mentioning humanity while clearly being entirely about humanity. The Nexari Collective found itself facing a situation that their philosophical mathematicians had never calculated. A species they had tried to contain had used their containment as an opportunity to become stronger. Emergency sessions debated solutions that ranged from direct military intervention, quickly abandoned when analysis revealed Kronos-Delta's defensive capabilities, to diplomatic engagement, which carried the uncomfortable implications had been wrong. Observer Thexani submitted his final assessment from the monitoring station with the mathematical equivalent of resignation. His observations had been accurate, his analysis had been thorough, and his conclusions had been systematically ignored until numerical reality could no longer be denied. Subject species has established permanent installations exceeding all predictive parameters, he recorded, using the sort of technical language that carefully avoided admitting how spectacularly wrong everyone had been. Recommend immediate recalculation of containment protocols and reassessment of human variables. The monitoring station itself had become something of an embarrassment. What had been intended as a symbol of Nexari analytical superiority now served as a reminder that the observers had fundamentally misunderstood what they were observing. The humans below had built something that challenged the basic mathematical assumptions of galactic civilization. Prime Assessor Kiel-Vothan's final analysis became required study at calculation academies across Nexari space, though not for the reasons he had intended. His detailed examination of human adaptive capabilities served as a case study in the dangers of assuming mathematical models could predict biological creativity and strategic innovation. The fortress world of Kronos-Delta stood as a testament to humanity's fundamental refusal to accept mathematical limitations as actually limiting. What should have been a cosmic exile had become a strategic stronghold. What should have been containment had become expansion. What should have been a solution had become a variable that rendered all previous calculations obsolete. Colonel Moreau walked the surface installations as Kronos-Delta's multiple moons illuminated defensive positions that could coordinate resistance against anything the galaxy might calculate. The crystalline formations that had been intended as obstacles now hummed with energy that powered a civilization that was simultaneously more human and more advanced than anything their species had built in more conventional circumstances. In the end, the Nexari had given humanity exactly what they had needed: a challenge worthy of their adaptive capabilities, resources sufficient for their engineering creativity, and the motivation that comes from being told something is mathematically impossible. They had locked humans in what they calculated was a prison, never realizing they were actually building them a fortress. The galaxy would spend decades recalculating the implications of that error, while the humans of Kronos-Delta continued doing what humans do best: turning mathematical impossibilities into engineering opportunities, transforming obstacles into advantages, and proving that some variables simply refuse to be contained by any equation. And sometimes, late at night when the monitoring station's lights blinked in the darkness above, Colonel Moreau would look up at those Nexari observers and smile. After all, someone had to keep an eye on the mathematicians, and it might as well be the species that had learned to divide by zero and get useful answers VVV.